I have the great honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this session, Dr. Jermaine M. Davis. Now, who is Dr. Davis? Well, before receiving the prestigious College Instructor of the Year award, Dr. Davis worked in corporate America in IBM, Keebler Cookies, and Frito-Lay. Now he's an award-winning professor of communication studies at Century College and organizational leadership at St. Catherine's University in Minnesota. Dr. Jermaine has authored and co-authored over 10 books. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree and a master's degree in speech communication and a doctorate in organizational leadership. Dr. Davis is an international speaker and a leadership coach. He engages audiences with his unique style of speaking known as edutainment, a fun combination of education and entertainment. Organizations like 3M, Best Buy, Medtronic, Sam's Club, Prudential, and the West Point Military Academy regularly seek out Dr. Davis's experiences and expertise in the areas of employee engagement and leadership development.
Thank you, Bill, for that awesome introduction. Greetings, everyone. I like to begin with a quote. I love quotes. One of my favorite psychologists is by the name of Abraham Maslow. And Abraham Maslow says this: if the only tool you have inside your toolbox is a hammer, you will begin to treat every problem like a nail. I want you to really think about this as we explore the topic of leading and working with an inclusive lens. The organizations, the leaders, and the teams that possess multiple tools inside of their toolbox, inside of their toolkit, will be more effective in building an inclusive, diverse, and equitable workplace. So as we go through this presentation, I want you to really think about what tools am I putting inside my toolbox and toolkit to be more effective as I lead and work up, down, and across my organization. First, I want to share a concept with you. It's called the fallacy of shoulds. When you think about creating an inclusive organization, one of the things great leaders do is they are aware of what I call the real world versus the ideal world. The real world says that our society, our workplaces, our schools, our communities, even our houses of faith and worship are becoming more multicultural, more multi-ethnic, more multilingual, multi-gender, multifaceted. So that is a reality. So what the fallacy of should says is that people lack the ability to distinguish between the real world and the ideal world. In other words, they get stuck on what should be versus what is. Healthy teams and organizations that are truly inclusive or seeking to build an inclusive environment, they embrace reality. There's a statistic according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it simply says 50% of the kids in the United States of America under the age of 10 are kids of color. Now you may be saying to yourself, what does this mean to me, my work, and my life? This means that this could be your patients, these could be your neighbors. For my case, I'm a college professor. These are my students. So this relevant statistic says things are shifting and things are changing. And inclusive organizations embrace reality. See, the fallacy of shoulds is when people get stuck on, well, here's how things should be. We shouldn't have to make these adjustments. But reality says, if we're going to be efficient, if we're going to be efficient, and if we're going to be effective, we have to deal with reality. And this is why I love this quote by Albert Einstein. The significant problems we face today cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. Inclusive teams and organizations, you know what they do? They do things differently. What do you mean, Jermaine? They do things differently by thinking differently and adopting inclusive practices. Now, I want to say that again because it's going to be really critical as you're coaching, as you're mentoring, as you're recruiting, as you're attracting diverse talent. Inclusive teams, leaders, and organizations, they think differently and they adapt inclusive practices that positions their organization for future success. One of my favorite quotes simply says, "What got you here won't get you there." So as you think about cultivating this space that celebrates, honors, and recognizes the different dimensions of diversity within your organization, I want you to begin to think, how do we create a space for that? So we have to think differently and we have to behave differently. With that said, there's a concept that I want to share with you. And this is a game changer, only if you're willing to implement this inclusive practice. Now I want you to think about this. Every time that you and I go into a space, an environment, an organization, there is a certain tone, there's a certain vibe, there's a certain aura that you feel. And in communication, they call this communication climate. And what it essentially is, it's the emotional tone of that environment, of that organization. Now, because we are exploring the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I would like for you to think about your place of work. What's the DEI climate within your organization? Is it welcoming? Is it friendly? Is it inclusive? Or is it unfriendly? Is it unhealthy? Do people feel welcome when they come into that space? Now you might be saying, Jermaine, does this really matter? Absolutely. There was research done out of Princeton University by Dr. Daniel Kahneman. And here's what Dr. Daniel Kahneman says. Every day we all get 20,000 moments. And the average moment lasts 1, 2, 3, about 3 seconds. And what Dr. Daniel Kahneman says is that the mind keeps track, it keeps scores of the experience. It's almost like a customer service experience, or in your case, it's like a patient experience and the experience that their family may have. So all organizations, all relationships have an emotional tone. But specifically, if you're going to be inclusive, I really want you to begin to think about what is my organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion communication climate. And it's created 2 ways, simply. By positive behaviors or negative behaviors. And here's one of the things I want you to begin to think about. What you allow, you teach. It's really critical for leaders to set the tone of a DEI communication climate. So here's 3 ways that leaders can lead by example and demonstrate and building a positive and healthy DEI communication climate. Number 1, they walk the walk of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Number 2, they talk the talk of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And number 3, they walk and talk simultaneously. You know, rest in peace to my mother. When I was growing up in Chicago, my mother always used to tell me this. JD, this is what they call me in Chicago. When your audio matches your video, then I believe you. So many organizations could have on their website that we value diversity, we embrace diversity. Here is the thing. What do people experience in your environment? Remember, a communication climate does not create itself. It must be deliberate, intentional, and purposeful. So I just want you to process this question. As you lean in to this quick topic here, my question to you is, what behavioral practices should your organization adopt to cultivate a positive DEI communication climate? So I'll share some tips with you. One of the things to think about is worldview. Now, I know you're sitting along. This is a virtual experience, but I want you to think about your worldview. We all have a worldview. Our worldview is simply how we see the world. And some of us see the world the same, similar, or radically different. So when we get to the workspace, it's really critical that we understand how our worldview shows up. And if we're not aware of our worldview, then our biases, our assumptions, our prejudices, and our stereotypes can make a huge impact on the employee experience and the patient experience. For example, I grew up inner city Chicago. I grew up in an urban community. When I went to college, I found myself at a predominantly white college, Elmhurst College in Elmhurst, Illinois, and it was in a suburb. And I had many friends who had a suburban experience in contrast to my urban experience. And then I met friends who had a farming or a rural experience. So this all shapes how we show up. And if we're not aware of that, here's what happens. I want you to look at this visual here. We begin to bump heads. We start clashing because one person thinks, well, my worldview is better than your worldview. So then we clash. And when this happens in the workplace, here's what suffers: productivity, effectiveness, efficiency, and again, the employee experience begins to dwindle, and then this trickle down to the patient experience. So when we talk about the business case for DEI, we need to consider this. So this is what I mean. What is diversity? There's many definitions of diversity, but here's one of the things I want you to take away. Diversity is all the characteristics and qualities making people uniquely different and similar. Building an inclusive workplace means that we are aware of not just the visible dimensions of diversity, but the invisible dimensions of diversity. Mental illnesses, people's sexual orientation, sometimes people's gender identity. So these matters. Oftentimes people only look at the external. And again, that is one dimension of diversity, but inclusive organizations understand that we must honor and celebrate the visible dimensions of diversity and the visible dimensions of diversity. I was speaking once and someone said, you know, Jermaine, what I think is really interesting is that we're focusing on our differences and not our similarities. And I said, well, yes and no. Yes, we are focusing on our differences because here's the truth of the matter. People don't have conflict over their similarities. They have conflict over their differences. And when we learn to work through our differences and manage our differences, we can have a more powerful organization. Takes me to one of my favorite quotes by Zora Neale Hurston, the anthropologist and writer and author. When Zora Neale Hurston says, I would rather be looked over than overlooked. Inclusive teams, leaders, and organizations, you know what they do? They notice differences. That is one of the tenements of a healthy, inclusive organizations. Why? Because they understand that differences make a difference. You've probably heard someone says, hey, I don't see gender. I don't see sexual orientation. I don't see race. Well, if you don't see and acknowledge these unique things that are peculiar to people, then you can't fully engage them. If you don't see racism, and that is a result of not seeing color. Color matters, difference matters, orientation matters. So it's leaning in and saying, it's about understanding your answer to this question. What difference does the difference make? Next, we talk about culture. Another thing, when people bring their worldview, they bring their culture with them. They bring their shared way of life. They bring their beliefs, their customs, and their traditions. And again, our culture is not a bad thing. Our culture is how we do things. It's how we've been shaped. It's how we've been formed. So here's a quick tip. The platinum rule versus the golden rule. If you're going to create an inclusive environment, the golden rule says treat people the way they want to be treated. You know what the platinum rule says? Treat people. Get really specific in understanding how people want to be treated. That is the platinum rule. The golden rule says treat people the way you want to be treated. So I'm making an assumption that everyone wants to be treated like Jermaine Davis. And that leads to conflict, especially in intercultural differences. So it's really understanding. The golden rule says, I'm going to start with a good intent. But if I'm really going to be inclusive, I need to understand specifically and uniquely about that culture and then embrace those nuances. So as I begin to close out, I want to leave you with a couple of things here. And that is simply this. Healthy organizations that truly embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's 4 things that they honor: knowledge, skill, will, and desire. Here's what I mean. Knowledge is knowing what to do. That is doing your due diligence and understanding the unique dimensions of diversity, the unique cultures amongst your employees and the patients that you serve, up, down, and across your organization. The skills is learning how to do things. How do I communicate with someone from a different culture? How do I communicate effectively when someone's native language is not English? How do I engage with someone who has a different religious or spiritual practice that they observe? So skill is the practical application on how. You know what the will is? The will is the mindset. I am going to commit to a growth mindset so I can learn to be inclusive up, down, and across my organization to be effective. And you know what desire is? Desire is simply the motivation. And when you embrace knowledge, skill, will, and desire, and you teach these strategies up, down, and across your organization, you will begin the process. And again, it's a process of creating an inclusive environment where individuals learn how to lead and work effectively with a diversity and an inclusive lens to build a holistic environment so all people can thrive and succeed. I would like to say thank you for this opportunity. My name is Dr. Jermaine Davis, and I wish you well on your journey of leading and working with an inclusive lens. Thank you so much.